Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and as always, I'm here with Bill Schofield and John Harrigan. Hey guys, how are you?
Doing good, man.
Great to be with you guys, as always. Anything new?
Yeah, we were talking, before the show of my son Benjamin is just finishing up, about to graduate. We're all going to go down to Kenya, and he's just having proud dad moment lately. He's just been doing really well over the last year, and led worship in front of the whole school last weekend, and which was awesome. It's awesome. So yeah, he's doing great.
So cool, man. It's awesome. How about you, Bill? Anything new?
No, we're just wrapping up the school year here too. So I'm in between graduations. My oldest graduated last year, and so yeah, we're just kind of starting off our summer, and it's good, man.
Well, yeah, Bill, that's awesome. Great to hear how things are going with you guys. Listeners, it is always good to have you on our show today. We want to continue talking about the parables. As you know, this season we've been highlighting the parables of Jesus, putting them in their historical context, highlighting the commonly held apocalyptic framework of the day. And last week, we spent some time talking about the parable of the wise and the foolish servants and the 10 virgins from Matthew 24 and 25. And this week, we want to continue in Matthew 25 and talk about the parable of the talents, specifically Matthew 25, verses 14 to 30, and then the parallel in Luke 19. So, guys, let's just start by doing what we always do. Let's just read the parable. I'll read Matthew's version, and then let's get a little context around the parable, and then maybe dive into some of the details like we always do. So this is Matthew 25, starting in verse 14. Jesus says, "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them and made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' And he who had 2 talents came forward, saying, 'Master, you've delivered to me 2 talents. Here I've made 2 talents more.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master.' He who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and I hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.' But his master answered him, 'You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scattered no seed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Well, guys, like we've seen so much, there's apocalyptic connections, apocalyptic language in this parable, the settling of accounts. Let's get into some of these details a little bit and highlight the context.
Yeah, I think, like you said, the settling of accounts is kind of the anchor in everybody's mind of the parable, what the parable revolves around or concludes with. And that would be associated with the day of the Lord, the eschatological judgment, which then is, the parable ends, the last verse, with the unfaithful or slothful servant being thrown into the outer darkness with the weeping and gnashing of teeth, which is elsewhere associated with Gehenna. And you also have, the joy of the master, which is associated with banquets. Wealthy people throw banquets, and there's whatever along those lines. And so it's associated with, the age to come and the glory and joys of the age to come as commonly expected at the time. And then also the whole parable is followed with the conclusion of the eschatological narrative that began in chapter 24. And so the final judgment is not, another parable. The sheep and the goats in the final judgment at the end of Matthew 25 is just a metaphor, but it actually picks up from chapter 24, verse 31. Then he'll send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they'll gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. And then he goes into the different parables and then picks up in chapter 25, 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory with all of the angels, he'll sit on his glorious throne. And then it goes into the judgment of the nations after that. And so the eschatological narrative is picked back up immediately following the parable of the talents, which indicates that that's what everybody has in mind. That's the context for the parable, and that's what is meant by the settling of accounts, the weeping and gnashing of teeth, and the joy of the master.
Yeah, John, that's really good. I think it's really important that we see this parable just in continuity with the previous parables we've been looking at, where we've seen themes of watchfulness, faithfulness, especially in Matthew, like last week when we talked about the parable of the wise and the foolish servants and the 10 virgins. All these parables are really saying the same thing, especially in Matthew, emphasizing the importance of stewardship and management and faithfulness to that stewardship and management. We've talked about all of this being spoken to either the leadership of Israel or the people of Israel in context to the covenant. And I think we're going to see today that that really is no different in this parable as well.
Yeah, and I think, this parable particularly highlights confidence, eschatological faith, and, kind of the view of God in light of the eschatological judgment,
right.
That conditions our present response. What comes to mind from this parable is like Luke 12, where Jesus says, "Fear not, little flock, for your Father is pleased. It's his good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Therefore, sell your possessions, give to the poor, store up treasures in heavens, where moth and rust can't destroy." And it's like the slothful response, the negative response, is because he lacked faith in the reality of the age to come. Therefore he didn't respond. Therefore he had this kind of negative relationship with God, and God's, he's a hard man or whatever. And so he didn't freely respond wholeheartedly because he lacked the faith of the reality of the age to come and the joy of the master. If he really believed in the promises of the scriptures and the Tanakh, then he would have responded wholeheartedly.
Yeah. At the preaching of John and Jesus, the whole point is this wholehearted response. And these parables, like we've talked about so much already, are trying to evoke this response of repentance and wholeheartedness in light of the coming eschatological judgment. So, guys, with that said, let's dig into some of the details of this parable. Let's start by talking about maybe who the master represents and what's going on with that.
Yeah, I think this parable, like with the other parables, and really all of the statements of Jesus, are really anything written throughout the Bible, really. We need to resist the temptation to make it be spoken primarily to me, be written to me.
Right.
And so it's written for the immediate audience. It was written for Matthew's audience, but it was spoken to Jesus' original audience. And so therefore, like you said, Josh, who is the master? The master is often interpreted as Jesus. And so the giving of the of the minas or the talents in Matthew is often a reference to like the first coming of Jesus, and then the settling of accounts is the second coming. Whereas it probably, actually the master is probably Yahweh, and the settling of accounts, of course, is the day of judgment. But it shifts it a little bit when the immediate audience would hear who the master is, because they would have already seen themselves and their contemporaries as entrusted with the thing. And therefore, how they're walking it out in light of the judgment has already been playing out. And so the minas and the talents, these are just sums of money at the time. Matthew's is kind of exaggerated to be large, and Luke's is a lot smaller. But the point is not the value of whatever the thing entrusted. The point is what is actually given, what they understand to be given, and most likely, and if the giver is Yahweh, which I think is the most reasonable reading in light of how the initial audience would have heard him, it seems like it was what was entrusted was actually entrusted to Israel, and so it would imply something like election or the Torah itself or the oracles of God. And it's a parable basically speaking about how different people are stewarding and handling being entrusted with the Torah and the oracles of God. That seems to be kind of how, like you guys described, it really is the apocalyptic scenario is being laid out from chapter 24 on through all of these various sections. But this seems to particularly be referencing how the Torah and the oracles of God are being stewarded by his audience.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to allegorize much beyond the general apocalyptic narrative that everybody is associating. Right. So it's not like with the 10 virgins or maidens. The oil doesn't particularly stand for anything. The lamps don't particularly stand for anything. The point is to be sober and stay awake and cognizant of the eschatological judgment and walk out this life, this age, in fear and trembling. And so this is just a different parable that kind of highlights, different aspects, but the same basic idea. And I think of 4th Ezra 7 as providing a good picture of what the settling of accounts, what the disciples have in mind when Jesus is talking about the settling of accounts. And so he says, 4th Ezra 7, starting verse 33, says, "And the Most High shall be revealed upon the seat of judgment, and compassion shall pass away, and patience shall be withdrawn. But judgment alone shall remain, truth shall stand, and faithfulness shall grow strong, and recompense shall follow, and the reward shall be manifest. Righteous deeds shall awake, and unrighteous deeds shall not sleep. Then the pit of torment shall appear, and opposite it shall be the place of rest, and the furnace of Gehenna shall be disclosed, and opposite the paradise of delight. Then the Most High will say to the nations, the Gentiles that have been raised from the dead, look now and understand whom you have denied, whom you have not served, whose commandments you have despised. Look on this side and on that. Here are delight and rest, and there are fire and torments. Thus he shall speak to them on the day of judgment." So you have a very similar kind of reenactment of what you see at the end of Matthew 25, with the nations being separated like sheep and goats, that some are welcomed into the eternal kingdom. Some righteous Gentiles shall be welcomed into the restoration of the kingdom to Israel at the end of Matthew 25, and the rest are cast into Gehenna, the flaming furnace. And so this is what, everybody has in mind with the settling of accounts right before that, and that, the carrying out of the multiplying of talents, or in Luke 19, the multiplying of minas, would be understood as righteous deeds in light of the Torah. The Gentiles have, of course, rejected, by and large, the Torah given to Israel, but some righteous Gentiles have received it and walk it out. Some wicked within Israel have rejected, walking out righteousness. And so you have a financial, parable that is speaking about walking out the Torah in fear and trembling in light of the eschatological judgment. And that you don't have to go beyond that, allegorizing each part or particular within it.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. And along those lines, it's also unnecessary to have this be some sort of historical survey of Israel, much less of church history, as some commentators would have you believe.
For sure.
It's definitely not a historical survey of church history, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a historical survey of Jewish history either, or of Israelite history. It's not that, the 10 minas was the Sinai generation and this minas. That's unnecessary. It's overly pressing the details.
Right.
What's being received by the audience is simply the commonly held the understanding, the common understanding that redemption has delayed.
Yep.
And rather than answering a bunch of detailed questions and inserting a bunch of new information, Jesus is kind of like us here on the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, folks. He's a one-string fiddle. He's basically saying, live in light of the judgment. Live in light of the judgment. What do you do in the delay? What do you do if the kingdom doesn't appear suddenly? Like in the Lucan parable or the Lucan parallel, he starts off by saying he said this parable because some of them thought the kingdom was going to appear immediately. So what do you do in light of the kingdom's delay? Well, you actually live in light of the judgment. You actually steward the oracles of God and live in light of that those things. We're going to be accounted for those things.
Yeah,
he's basically telling the audience, we're going to give an account for how we've stewarded the oracles, how we've stewarded the Torah. So just live in light of that. That seems to be the takeaway. I don't think they needed anything a whole lot fancier than that.
Yeah, that's really good. If you didn't listen to our episode last week, listeners, we spent some time, this was in our episode 15 last week, we spent some time talking about how the prophetic tradition and the apocalyptic tradition all emphasize this idea of a delay in the redemption, that this wasn't some Christian innovation, that it wasn't something later read into the passages by Christian thinkers and bishops in the early church later on, that this comes squarely from the prophetic and the apocalyptic tradition in Jewish thought, that there was a delay in the redemption. And so how does one behave in the midst of that delay? Well, this is I guess you could call it apocalyptic ethics, right? In light of the kingdom not appearing immediately, how should one behave? And so I think you're exactly right, Bill. This is what Jesus is describing. Some are responding appropriately to this delay and others are not responding appropriately to this delay. Yeah, I think we can see this parable along those lines as well.
Yeah, and I think the point on the delay, that we made last week was that the problem of the delay, as it's described in theological discussion, it was more like the complex of the delay, like, the vexation of the delay that's created in people's mind of how long, O Lord, and that's instilled in Israel's consciousness and Jewish consciousness at the time. It's ingrained because it's been literally centuries of waiting and expectation of the prophetic tradition playing out. And that expectation, becomes more and more apocalyptic over time, the intensity of that expectation, and thus the vexation of the delay becomes more and more intensified. And so the parables that Jesus tells, kind of within the eschatological narrative of Matthew 24 and then concluding in 25 are parables that address this vexation. And so the parable of the household managers, the wicked one says to himself, my master is delayed, and he begins to beat the servants. The 10 virgins, the bridegroom is delayed and they fall asleep. And you have the parable of the talents, the slothful servant, as it says in verse 26. Presumably he's slothful because of the delay, because of how he views the God of Israel. He has this response to the God of Israel because of the delay, and this vexation causes him to view God in a particular way and lose faith and expectation of the joy set before him, the joy of the master and the reward that he'll receive. So he doesn't respond appropriately and wholeheartedly. He responds slothfully. And so it falls in line, I think, with the other parables that come before, and then ultimately falls within the context of the eschatological narrative that begins in chapter 24 and then concludes at the end of 25.
Yeah, that's really good. So it really is the eschatological day of judgment, the eschatological accounting that drives faithfulness and sobriety and righteousness. And then a lack of focus is what leads to unfaithfulness and slothfulness. And that's what Jesus is getting at in this parable.
Yeah, and I think even more than that, it's the reward.
Yeah.
In everybody's mind, which is the hope of the resurrection, the new heavens and new earth, eternal life, living forever. It's the joy of the master, the joy of the wedding feast, the reward of the household manager. I was talking with a friend this weekend. We both have 4 kids here, and we were just talking about parenting, and we were talking about how parenting is really fairly simple. Is you constantly keep a reward in focus, and you have a little bit of judgment that's kept, in consciousness, and a lot of love in context to all that. And you're constantly pushing, if you do this and walk out and walk rightly, you're going to receive a reward in various forms as they get older. The reward changes, but there's always the threat of if you don't walk in righteousness, there's going to be judgment. But that's, if you know parenting, you can't make the judgment at the forefront all the time. It just wrecks things. And then a whole lot of love, and I'm with you, I'll help you, I love you. That has to just kind of cover everything. And so, I think the parable of the talents, you get a lot of that, where it's God is joyfully going to give you the kingdom and the joy of the age to come. But there is judgment and accounting, so be sober. And God loves you and is with you to the end, kind of mentality in it.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah, that's good. And this temptation to be slothful in light of the judgment's delay, while originally I think pretty clearly spoken by Jesus in a Jewish context, later on we see even this becomes a central part of the apostles' exhortation to even the Gentile disciples, is slothfulness in light of the delay. And First Corinthians 7 came to mind, where Paul's going to give the exhortation. The time is grown short, and he's going to talk about living, as though those who have wives, though they had none; those who mourn, as though they were not mourning, etc. Those who have possessions, as though they did not. But he actually kind of summarizes that in the next sentence. He says, because I want you to be free from anxiety. I want you to be free from anxieties. And so I'm giving you this exhortation so that you can just live in light of the Lord's coming, because people get weighed down and the delay becomes burdensome, and the delay becomes the delay is heavy.
Yeah.
But we need that constant reminder to live in light of the judgment in the delay, because otherwise you just renegotiate everything and you come up with scenarios that you think are going to play out well and they don't.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Bill, that the slothful servant, it wasn't like he just wasn't doing anything. He wasn't doing his life around what had been given to him.
Right.
I mean, he was living out some other life, which kind of goes along with the other parables, that we talked about, whatever, in Matthew 22, where you have excuses. Oh, I just bought a oxen. I just bought a business. I just got married, so I think that kind of plays into the slothful servant. He just sets the calling aside, and buries it or puts it in a napkin in Luke 19 or handkerchief or whatever, and goes about his own life and isn't concerned with the Lord's calling.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, guys, that's great. Well, I would say that most of the modern approaches to this parable are not generally in this same flow of thought. And as we're going to see, this is certainly not the case, especially with our friend N.T. Wright. Let me read a quick little quote here from Klein Snodgrass, who summarizes a little bit of the position of a lot of modern interpreters, especially that of N.T. Wright. He says, the parable in Luke, he's going to highlight Luke's version, is not pointing to the delay, but is announcing the manifestation of the kingdom immediately. Luke Johnson argued for this approach and has been followed by several, especially N.T. Wright, who views Jesus' entry into Jerusalem as a symbolic enactment of Yahweh's coming to Zion to judge and to save. He sees the parable as the key explanatory riddle showing the significance of Jesus' arrival. Rather than being at the beginning of the story, the hearers stand near the end of the story where the master is about to return. So, again, what Wright tends to do, and what a lot of modern approaches to this parable tend to do because of N.T. Wright, is he's taking this whole idea of Jesus coming, the master coming. The master is Jesus, who's coming to Jerusalem in 70 A.D. to judge, but the master is Yahweh too, because Yahweh is Jesus and whatever. But let's talk about this a little bit, guys, because oftentimes people will open up a commentary or open up a lot of N.T. Wright's works and read about this parable of how it has a massive importance for that particular theological agenda.
Yeah, and I'll read a little bit of that, a little bit of the section that Snodgrass is referencing in N.T. Wright's in Jesus and the Victory of God. And Wright says, I propose that this parable should be seen as a key explanatory riddle for Jesus' own action. He saw his journey to Jerusalem as the symbol and embodiment of Yahweh's return to Zion. It was a new encoding in an acted narrative of the widespread and well-known biblical prophecies we set out earlier. Jesus was hinting. Jesus is always hinting in Wright, because he doesn't actually say what he wants them to say. Jesus is hinting for those with ears to hear that he was riding over the Mount of Olives, celebrating the coming kingdom, and warning Jerusalem that it would mean judgment for those who reject him and his way of peace. So Yahweh was returning to his people, his city, and his temple. But who would abide the day of his coming? And the day of his coming here, of course, means AD 70. Does not mean the Perusia. But so that's the section that he's referencing, and that's about as drafty as they come. Well,
I mean, the thing that I do appreciate about N.T. Wright is his criticism of the Greek narrative. And that's what Tom is known for, is his kind of overall criticism of Plato's adoption within early, Christian theological thought. And what Tom is doing is, throughout that whole section, is arguing against what he calls the traditional interpretation. And the traditional interpretation is kind of the Hellenistic rereading or the Greek narrative that understands the beginning of the parable as Jesus going to immaterial heaven. The interim time is between now and the second coming, when he comes to destroy everything and take everyone to immaterial heaven. So he's pushing back against that, which I think is is very positive.
Sure.
He goes back to first century Judaism, but instead of embracing Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic thought, he reimagines it and primarily, realizes it, which is what Bill was reading about, that Jesus is, hinting at and subversively realizing all of Jewish prophecies. Ultimately, in 70 AD, the negative side of the Jewish prophecies. So he goes on in that same section in Jesus and the Victory of God, he says, this is not a denial of the imminence of the kingdom. It's a warning about what that imminent kingdom will entail. The parable functions, like so many, as a devastating redefinition of the kingdom of God. Yes, the kingdom does mean the return of Yahweh to Zion. Yes, this kingdom is even now about to appear, but no, this will not be a cause of celebration for nationalistic Israel. In Matthew, the other parables in chapter 25 are focused not on the personal return of Jesus after a long interval in which the church is left behind, but on the great judgment which is coming very soon upon Jerusalem and her current leaders, and which signals the vindication of Jesus and his people as the true Israel. Which is bizarre, right? That 70 AD would somehow vindicate those that believe Jesus is Israel's Messiah, as though that actually played out that way. Like, no unbelieving Jews looked at 70 AD and went, oh, those followers of Jesus of Nazareth were right. That, of course, never happened.
Right.
But what I do appreciate about N.T. Wright is that at least he goes back to first century Judaism and kind of pushes back against the Greek narrative. But then what he does to instead of just embracing first century Jewish apocalyptic thought as the context and framework, he, re-narrates that through realized eschatology, which would just be bizarre, I think, to a first century Jew if you told them that 70 AD is the fulfillment of Israel's hope.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, guys, this is great. I think, looking at this parable and seeing it in its original context, how the hearers would have heard it, and how we've seen that it's in continuity with so many of the other parables and the other themes that Jesus has been speaking of already. I think this, hopefully, listeners, has been helpful to you as well. And next week, we want to spend some time talking about a popular parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10. So join us next time. And listeners, thanks again for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.